I'm Connor Rebush, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. At the beginning of last week's episode, I, your host, Connor Rebush, told you that we had a great fight to discuss, and I'm asking you, co-host Patrick Wyman, was that not even better than we expected it would be?
Is everything we thought it could be and so much more on so many levels. I mean, I think that what Dominick Cruz did in terms of being able to come back from having had one full training camp in the last 51 months, it is since he fought Demetrius Johnson in October of 2011, to not only look not physically diminished, but to be better skill-wise than he was before, and to win a fight against a next-generation champion in TJ Dillashaw. Like, that is an all-time great sports accomplishment, period.
Yeah, it's a hell of a story.
Not just MMA, not just combat sports, period. Oh, my God, amazing.
I absolutely agree. And if you guys don't know what we're talking about, of course, Pat already mentioned Dominick Cruz, the new UFC bantamweight champion. Spoilers. If you haven't seen Dillashaw versus Cruz yet, I know sometimes you're forced to skip a card. There's a lot of them these days. Go back right now before you listen to this episode and watch it, because it was a fantastic fight. I think one of those fights that probably has more rewatch value than a Total War a la Robbie Lawler versus Carlos Condit. Not that it was as dramatic, but there was a lot to be gained from rewatching that fight over and over again. There are so many different subtleties and nuances you can pick up, so go check it out if you haven't, assuming that you have, because why would you be listening to this show if you weren't that into technical high-level MMA? Man, what a fantastic fight. And for the rest of the episode today, for the most of today's episode, we're going to try to break down all of those subtleties I mentioned before. We'll get a quick note about the scoring out of the way right now. Pat, both you and I scored this fight for TJ Dillashaw.
We did indeed. I don't think there's any point in us really harping on it. Like,
no.
It was a close fight. I think it was one of the closest fights I've ever seen. Like, I'm firm in my scoring. I think that TJ Dillashaw won the fight. But you could make a legitimate case for either guy in 4 of the 5 rounds, or 3 of the 5 rounds at the very least. Like, I think 2 was pretty much to Cruz, and 4 went pretty much to Dillashaw. But every other round, there's a good argument to be made for either guy, depending on what side you come down on.
Yeah, and even those, compare those to the clearness of the rounds in Lawler versus Condit. Nowhere close. Where Lawler versus Condit came down to one round that everyone argued incessantly about, this whole fight was so close and so competitive. Even the rounds that were relatively clear were very close and competitive. I don't consider myself a prophetic man. I'm not a clairvoyant. But at the end of this fight, before the decision was announced, I turned to my girlfriend with whom I was watching the fight, and I said, this decision is going to piss a lot of people off. Because there's no way you can have a fight that close and competitive. And with all of the emotions that were going in, people rooting for their favorite fighters, that it wasn't going to upset somebody. It's just impossible because it was so close. It really comes down to subjectivity. So if you guys want to hear our opinions on how scoring works and how we score fights, and maybe get a sense for why we both thought Dillashaw should have won this fight, you can check out our discussion on scoring in the beginning of the breathlessly reviewing Lawler versus Condit episode. We're not going to get into that today. Instead, what we're going to talk about is the nitty-gritty of the fight itself. It was just beautiful. Everything. So many adjustments, so many tiny little subtle momentum swings, both guys trying so hard to beat the other guy up, and both of them being so good at stopping that from happening. Both of them negating each other so well and constantly adapting to find new ways to get at each other. I think the first thing that stood out to me in this fight, Pat, is how frustrating it is to fight Dominick Cruz. Because I don't think I fully took that into account when we were previewing this fight. I think I knew that past opponents had been frustrated by Cruz, but I did think to myself, TJ Dillashaw won't be as frustrated as them because he's not going to wait around and look at what Cruz is doing and try to guess what he's doing next. Instead, he's going to try to make Cruz guess what he's doing. He did do that. He still ended up getting frustrated early on in this fight.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that really bothered me about this commentary was the extent to which it continued to insist that Dillashaw was getting frustrated. And there were stretches where he got frustrated. I'm watching the second round right now. I've followed up on your lead, and I have taken to watching the fights in the background as we record this. And there are a couple of stretches in the second round where Dillashaw seems to get a bit frustrated, a little bit in the first round, maybe for a few seconds in each of the remaining rounds. But for the most part, I think Dillashaw did a really good job of sticking with what he wanted to do. He filled the air with volume, which in some sense I think contributed to the fact that contributed to him losing the fight, despite landing at essentially the same rate as Cruz. The fact that he missed on like 100 more strikes created the perception that he wasn't landing as much as he was.
That Cruz was being more accurate than him, more efficient, or was landing when he chose to land, while Dillashaw was not landing half of the time that it seemed he wanted to, even though the fact that he landed as many strikes as he did is a testament to how effective his volume was.
Yeah, and just a quick note on scoring. Defense is not a scoring criterion. Defense is its own reward in that you don't get hit. Yeah. Like the 2012 version of the Unified Rules of MMA put out by the Association of Boxing Commissions, which is what the UFC follows in every venue where it holds fights, has a section where it explicitly says, on removal of effective defense as a scoring criterion. Like, the fact that you're not getting hit matters. It is what you're scoring, not like some inherent benefit to defense. That's not a scoring thing.
Which I love. And when I say that, people think I don't care about defense. And I'm a guy who adores fighting technique, so how could I not love good defense? I just think that defense is a means to a different end than winning the fight. In the same way that volume does not win you or lose you a fight. Landing more and better punches wins you or loses you a fight. And so I think that's what the conversation that Dillashaw and Cruz was having in this fight was not, who is going to be missing more. It's who's going to be landing more and being more effective. And can we talk about defense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think that's what frustrated Dillashaw in the early going. And when I say this, I think Joe Rogan was a little too fixated on how well Cruz is doing. He does tend to pick up on a narrative early in fights with his commentary and go with it, particularly when it's along the lines of underdog bias. We've known this about Joe in the past. Very enthusiastic, very fun commentator, not necessarily a good person to guide you through the process of a fight. But Dillashaw did have a moment of frustration early in the fight, I think probably near the end of the first round and then going through most of the second round. And I think it's when he realized that his pressure wasn't as immediately as effective as he thought it would be, because Cruz was doing a fantastic job not only of creating distance, but maintaining and enforcing distance as well by landing shots as he was moving off. Even when he was backing up in straight lines, he was far more threatening going backwards in this fight than he has been in the past.
Yeah, that was what stood out to me as one of the two big improvements that Cruz had made, was how much better he was as a counterpuncher. Like in the past, when Cruz has picked his spots to sit down on a counterpunch, it's been one at a time. At the very most two at a time, but almost never more than one. In this fight, sure, Cruz was still throwing ones, but he was throwing them much more frequently than he has in the past. He picked those spots much more frequently. And he also picked spots to throw combinations. He would throw 2, 3, 4 shots at a time as Dillashaw was coming in. I think that surprised Dillashaw, that he couldn't immediately reset and stay on him.
Yes.
That he had to worry about the counters, even if they weren't the most threatening punches in the world.
Yeah.
They were still a thing that he had to worry about.
It was so much more difficult for him to outmaneuver and to maintain the distance he likes against Cruz than it has been against previous opponents, not just because Cruz is more fleet-footed, but because Cruz was adjusting and attacking at the same time as Dillashaw. So there were moments that I think really spelled out the fact that Dillashaw was getting frustrated when he decided to just charge after Cruz with like a 5 or 6 punch combination, just coming after him 1-2, 1-2, pumping away with both fists, and Cruz was just peppering him with these light little shots in between. Not very effective. Dominick Cruz has never had the best punching form, and it certainly didn't look amazing for much of this fight. A lot of weird winging, casting type punches, but he was peppering Dillashaw as Dillashaw was coming forward, and Dillashaw was just gunning away. He was eager to get his hands on Dominick Cruz, but had not yet found the way to do so. And I think that's really a testament to Cruz's awkward footwork, his back and forth upper body movement, which was better than it has been, and the fact that he was linking together several punches while moving off on those angles.
Yeah, did it seem to you, Connor, watching this fight, that Cruz's footwork looked much more efficient than it has in the past?
Yeah. You know what else I noticed too? Going back to Joe Rogan's commentary for a moment, Joe picked up on how heavily Dominick Cruz is breathing. really early into the fight, which happens every time. Are Dominick Cruz and TJ Dillashaw the two best tired fighters on the planet right now?
Well, I don't think Dillashaw really gets tired in the same way that Cruz does, but Cruz looks like that in every fight. Yeah. He looked like that in the Uriah Faber fight. He looked like that in the Demetrius Johnson fight. Like, this is how Cruz looks after about the first 7 minutes of a fight. It just is.
I think he looks this way after about the first 3 minutes. He's like lifting his shoulders up and stretching his back out and trying to get more air into his lungs, and there's never enough. It doesn't really affect him that much. It doesn't really have that big of an effect on him.
I think it's almost like a mental tick with him.
Sure, yeah, the shrugging.
So it's a visual sign that he's resetting mentally.
Yes.
So he circles out, then he's like, okay, now we're going to do it again. And he takes a second to collect himself, and I think he's programming the next couple of angles that he's going to hit, and there he goes. And off he goes again. Like, I'm watching him do it right now in the third round.
Yeah.
It's really funny. But so, okay, one question I wanted to bounce off you, Connor. Mm-hmm. Do you think that Dillashaw erred by throwing so many naked high kicks?
I don't really understand what the point was. It did seem like, first of all, I do think Dominick Cruz got into his head a little bit. Getting into someone's head is maybe overrated, but also effective. And I think the moment you asking yourself, is he in my head? He's in your head. So it's very difficult to combat. I think he really seemed to have bought into the idea that he was going to knock Cruz out with a right head kick. Because he and Dwayne Ludwig both said it before the fight. He went really gung-ho for it in that first round. He was really, really eager to get that head kick on Cruz's head, even though the leg kicks and the body kicks were the most effective part of his arsenal.
This is what I wrote about at some length in my post-fight technical recap. Like, if Dillashaw had just replaced half of those head kicks with body and leg kicks, I think he probably would have won the fight going into the later rounds. If he had just worn Cruz down a little bit more to the body and the legs, if he had limited his movement a little more, taken a little bit more out of his gas tank, he would have put himself in position to be winning the fight there. Because it's not just the attrition, it's also that messes with Cruz's range, and it did so really effectively as the fight went on. Like, I don't think people realize when you throw a high kick is only extending about the range of your cross, maybe a little bit beyond the range of your cross with a little more margin for error because it's a kick. But a body kick stretches out another 3-4 inches, and a leg kick another 2-3 inches past that. So, like, if you're looking to take away somebody's space, if you think about the area of a circle, when you extend the radius of that circle another 2 inches or another 4 or 5 inches with a leg kick, that takes away. Think about how much volume of space that takes away that Cruz can move into. Because the purpose of the head kick was to catch Cruz as he was moving off with his hands down, as he does.
Yeah, well, I really think that Cruz became fixated, as so many fighters have in the past, on Dillashaw rather, on Cruz's hand position. And I think this speaks to the benefit of carrying one's hands low. I really do. A lot of people in the past, because I've had this discussion a million times about fighting with a lowered guard. And typically when I'm talking about a lowered guard, I'm not talking about one as relaxed as Dominick Cruz's. I would not. To borrow Joe Rogan's usual phrasing, I would not advise new fighters, most of them, to fight like Dominick Cruz and hold your hands literally below your waist at almost at all times, which he does. He carries his hands very low. But I think the way that Cruz does this really speaks to its advantages. In the past, when this discussion has come up, I have gotten people, often begrudgingly, because people are really, really attached to the idea that you have to have your hands up if you're fighting. I've gotten people to begrudgingly agree with me that there are offensive advantages to carrying your hands low, that you can hide the angles of your attacks. Your punches can come out from beneath the opponent's field of vision and therefore be harder to predict. And you can be a little closer to a natural punching position where you're not naturally going to throw a punch from your cheek. You're going to throw it more from your shoulder. So I've gotten people to agree with that it maybe it encourages punching. But almost no one has ever agreed that it can actually enhance your defense to carry your hands low. And while it takes a special person to do it, with Dominick Cruz, it does. In the same way that Anderson Silva used to do it. Because I think it is so hard to have Dominick Cruz standing in front of you with his head as wide open as a head can possibly be, often leaning towards you, and not swing for his head. And when you're confident in your footwork and your head movement as Dominick Cruz is, when you're always ready to go bounding away or off to the side, and you're coming with counters from those awkward lowered hand positions, then you are going to really frustrate your opponents. His head's right there. I think that's really what we saw here. So Dillashaw, who's normally a very smart fighter, has great feel for fights, as we've said before, just couldn't convince himself to go for the legs as often as he probably should have.
Yeah, and that to me was the major problem here. That was the issue. That is how, to me, Dillashaw lost himself the fight. That if he had piled up, because I think he probably threw, by a rough count, 10 more, 15 more high kicks than he should have.
Sure.
And if even half of those land to the legs and the body, suddenly those rounds look a lot different scoring-wise.
Well, especially, retrospectively, you consider the fact that he seems to have re-aggravated some old injury of Dominick Cruz's in the fourth round of the fight. So if that had happened earlier, how much stronger would the fight have seemed for him? Although I don't know that anything could have convinced Tony Weeks, who gave the last 4 rounds of the fight to Cruz. Either way, most people agree Dillashaw was picking up speed as the fight went on. How much easier would that have been if he had been chipping away at those legs, which really did seem to be a problem for Cruz?
Well, so Cruz said afterwards that it wasn't something that Dillashaw did to aggravate an injury. It was that he had plantar fasciitis in his foot, and after he could only take so much bouncing around on it before it eventually went. But it wasn't really Dillashaw that did.
I don't know how much stock I can put into that, especially given the fact that it seemed to be a kick that directly caused him to start limping.
I've had plantar fasciitis, and I really think that's about it. That you can take a particular amount of activity on it, but eventually it is going to go. Like that, there's a limit to how much your adrenaline and whatnot can push you through it. Like I actually believe Cruz on this one.
Can it not be aggravated by hitting the sciatic nerve over and over?
Not like that. It can be aggravated if somebody hits you with a kick and then you plant really hard on that foot.
Sure,
that can do it. Yeah, but no, I think it really was like that. There was just a set amount of wear and tear that could take over the course of a grueling, at that point, 17 minutes. So I don't know. It may be, but I really think it was more just the time of the fight.
That makes sense.
But yeah. So I mean, just what an incredible kind of thing. And I don't think that we really mean to be criticizing Dillashaw that much. It's just like you wonder what if he had played more with those things, because I understand the logic behind the head kick. There's the frustration of Cruz's head being there, sure, but there's also the you're trying to cut off somebody who likes to move laterally with circular strikes, and so we saw Dillashaw throwing a lot fewer straight punches in this fight than he has in the past. Why? Because you're trying to catch somebody circling out. So he threw a lot of right hooks. He threw a lot of left kicks. He threw a lot of right kicks, because those have more margin for error when you're trying to hit somebody who's moving laterally. Mm-hmm. It's hard to hit somebody whose head is never on the center line with straight punches. And with Cruz, there is no center line for you to key in on. It's constantly shifting, constantly moving. Basically, you're just hoping that you get lucky and you hit where his head happens to be at that particular moment.
Yeah, it's even as much as we've talked about. I did see a moment here where it does seem like a kick really aggravated that injury on Cruz. So who knows? I did see him take a kick and then suddenly start limping without putting weight on the foot. So I think it may be a combination of factors. But just to go back to that, I know we're both watching the fight as we discuss this. I absolutely agree with you there. I think... Why don't we take a quick break, actually? When we come back, I want to talk about the adjustments that Dillashaw made. Because I think the fact that Cruz ended up taking the decision, the fact that Cruz looked so fantastic after such a long layoff, that he was doing such an excellent job of moving and being defensive, I think that could tend to drown out the other narrative of this fight, which is that TJ Dillashaw, yes, he got frustrated, but he also adjusted like no past Dominick Cruz opponents have. So I want to talk about some of those adjustments after this break. Okay, wait, stop. Don't skip this break. I know you skip most of them. It's a podcast. It's not a radio show. You don't have to listen to the commercials. But if you follow my very simple instructions, you'll be doing a huge service to Heavy Hands, Pat, and myself. First, go to Stitcher.com or iTunes.com. You can use either of those services to subscribe to the show, which makes it really, really easy to listen to every episode and not have to go hunting for it on our confusing, badly designed website. Once you're there, give us a positive rating and a positive review. That means go to the little 5-star thing and click on the star all the way to the right. That's a 5-star rating. That's the best one you could possibly give us. And like 20 or 30 words about how you enjoy the show. It may not seem like much, but it's a huge help to us, and we really appreciate it. It helps us bring Heavy Hands to an ever-increasing audience, which is just good for everybody. So thank you for listening. Please take the time to give us a positive rating and review. next time that you're on at your computer, at your phone, whatever. iTunes.com, Stitcher.com, search for Heavy Hands, give a positive rating and a review. Thank you. And now, back to the show. And we are back. Before we resume our Dillashaw versus Cruz discussion, I want to thank some of the people who have pledged to help Heavy Hands out, $5 or more per month. This is from the month of December. Thanks very much to Emil Rainberg, Jorge Cabrera, Tom Grant, Scott Adkin, Liam Franks, and Justin Wilson. Thank you guys very much. If you also want to help support the show, you can find Heavy Hands on patreon.com. We have rewards for all sorts of things, anywhere from $1 up to $20. And we are going also, we're going to be adding a $10 reward for a subscribers only, a patron only forum on heavyhandspodcast.com where you can interact with Pat and I, and we can discuss things, maybe do like some discussions during fights as they're happening and things like that, answer your questions, ones that maybe aren't going to make it onto the show. But we want to be able to interact with you guys and give you guys a little extra something for helping to support the show, because we really do appreciate it. So thank you for those $5 contributions. Find out more on patreon.com. Just search Heavy Hands. Now, back to TJ Dillashaw versus Dominick Cruz. I wanted to talk about Dillashaw's adjustments because I noted that he was frustrated, and I think that is something that a lot of people picked up on. Joe Rogan picked up on it. Fans seemed to pick up on it. A lot of people thought the fact that Dillashaw was missing a lot early and then started to run into punches as he was kind of looking a little desperate for a way to land them. I think that made people think the fight was slipping out of his control. And what I was most impressed by in this fight is the fact that he came back from that brink. Because while I did not acknowledge that he might be frustrated just as past Cruz opponents were, I wasn't altogether surprised that he didn't stay frustrated like past Cruz opponents always have. Dillashaw made a ton of great adjustments as this fight went on. After that second round, he seemed to go back to his corner and decided, all right, we're not going to knock him out with the head kick like we thought we were. We're not going to blitz after him. He's too good. In fact, he's gotten better. We're going to have to figure out a way to get at him. And I thought he did a fantastic job of that. The one thing I really noticed from Dillashaw are the pauses that he inserted into his combinations coming forward, and that he filled these pauses with defensive movements. I thought his head movement, his upper body movement, worlds better than they've ever been in the past. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. He started breaking his rhythm. More or less in the fourth round, right? Yes. I think that was to me the biggest adjustment that he made in the fight, was figuring out, okay, I go right hook, stance switch, but instead of throwing right off the stance switch, half beat then low kick. Yeah. There's a sequence that he threw a couple of times in that in the fourth and the fifth round, and stuff like that is what made the difference, because he was able to play off of knowing what Cruz's reactions were going to be. He also started operating in more layers. Right, so instead of backing off, resetting, and getting back to the pressure, suddenly he threw more wrinkles in there. So I'm looking at this sequence right here. It starts with about 2 minutes left in the fifth round, or in the fourth round, where Cruz goes to throw a leg kick. TJ counters with an overhand right, but instead of getting out and resetting, he dives in on a takedown. He gets the takedown, he gets Cruz down, he immediately tries to scramble, but then he just sticks on Cruz. He tries to get his back, doesn't get his back, then he shoves Cruz up against the fence, and he starts going to town on him with knees to the thigh. He starts working him over there. So instead of backing off and resetting and getting back to what he thought his plan was, he let himself flow from phase to phase and transition to transition. Mm-hmm. He's like, okay, I don't need to be afraid of transitioning with Dominick Cruz. I can beat him in the transitions. And he started doing that more. And once every exchange started to include more layers to it, then I think Dillashaw really shone. I think that his ability to read his opponent in those spaces started to play a lot more.
Because I think he is the more organic fighter. You know, you mentioned how you think that Dominick's shoulder shrugging and deep breaths are a sign of him resetting. And he is, by the way, one of the few fighters I know of who has always had a cornerman telling him to reset. So I think it is very much an ingrained part of his style that he knows he needs a little room, a little time to breathe and sort of reestablish what he's going to do before he does it. And obviously Dillashaw, as this fight went on, proved that he does not need to do that he can change things up on the fly as he's in the pocket, as he's in punching range, and adapt. I think that example that you pointed out is fantastic. I just watched it right now. It was great, and one of the things that really cinched the fourth round for TJ. For me, it was not only the fact that there was a breaking rhythm, because we've talked about broken rhythm in the past. And we talk about how you will, generally the assumption is that you will attack and then kind of do nothing and then attack. And that'll be your half beat or your full beat between punches. And what I loved is that Dillashaw had an adaptation for how much more active Dominick Cruz was as a counterpuncher. He filled his half beats and his full beats. He filled those pauses between attacks with defense and footwork. So he was constantly advancing and defending himself as he came forward and in between his attacks, which I loved, because the thing that really gave him trouble early in the fight was coming forward, and Cruz was slinging these awkward looping counters and staying just outside of Dillashaw's reach and then circling away when his back hit the fence. So what Dillashaw would do was kind of draw the counter, and that would be his half beat when the counter came, and he would roll under the punch or he would block it, use it as an opportunity to pull one of those shifts, switch stances and move forward, and then attack after that. So I just thought it was a beautiful thing to watch, that he was using these level changes and nice tight active blocks to defend himself and stringing together these beautiful combinations while being pressed, while Cruz was trying to scare him off, and it just didn't work, despite the fact that it had come to the brink of working earlier in the fight. I was mystified by that.
Yeah, it was. I think Dillashaw made some really, really good adjustments to the things that Cruz was doing there. There was one thing that I wanted to hit on with Cruz that we talked about, that I mentioned a little bit last week, and that's Cruz's ability to just always make the right decisions. Mm-hmm. So I think this fight really exemplified that to me, that it showed through in the timing on his counters, in his choice of counter shots, his decisions for when to get out of range and when to plant his feet and throw. But that sequence that we just talked about in the fourth round, where Dillashaw shoves him up against the fence and starts kneeing him repeatedly, Cruz grabs the fence twice in that sequence. And he doesn't, and then Herb Dean says, if you do it again, I'm going to take a point. What does Cruz do? He doesn't grab the fence a third time.
Yes.
He used his fouls. But to me, that was a really, really good a really good example of Cruz just knowing how far he can push things, what his options are under any given set of circumstances, knowing that, okay, if I have X, Y, and Z options available to me, the ability to, in a difficult situation, pick the correct one, this fight to me exemplified Cruz's ability to just do that all the time.
Well, and he spent the last 10 minutes of the fight limping, and disguised it and still moved well enough to defend himself most of the time. It's not like Dillashaw. The vast majority of fighters, if they're operating on a bum leg, you are going to find it probably at least 150% more easy to hit them. Often twice as easy to hit them. 200% more of your shots are going to land. It really wasn't that easy for TJ Dillashaw to hit Cruz, even after his leg seemed to go out from under him. He is an excellent decision maker, and I think that it's important to note that, because often I think it seems derogatory when we say that someone is more of a rote fighter, using our specialized definitions. I am going to work on a glossary of terms for this show, by the way. I've mentioned that in the past. You and I have our own secret language now. Like little kids talking to each other. So I want other people to be understand what we're talking about. But when we say a rote fighter, we don't mean that they don't think or that they're dumb or somehow have low fight IQ. Obviously, that's not Dominick Cruz. What it kind of means to us is that they have to run through motions that they have well rehearsed, and that they're kind of more flowchart fighters. They're picking whole sequences from a flowchart in their head and saying, okay, I'm going to move on to this, and I'm going to put these three pieces together the way I've put them together in training. And the difference, that opposed to TJ Dillashaw, who is going to put pieces together as they appear to him. But obviously, Dominick Cruz can still make smart decisions on the fly. He's not going to select his techniques out of thin air in the same way. He's obviously using things that he has rehearsed and trained very carefully, and using them. He's playing to the script exactly as he prepared it. But when the thing has come up, he chooses very, very wisely when to use those pieces. He's very intelligent. And as brief as they were, I thought the wrestling scrambles in this fight were some of the most fascinating parts of the whole thing.
Absolutely. I mean, Cruz was not really able to get much going, which didn't really surprise me. That's kind of how I thought those exchanges would go. But I was shocked at how effortless Dillashaw made it to get back up to his feet and to avoid getting into any sort of trouble. I don't think Cruz landed a single shot on the ground in any of those exchanges, and he wasn't able to land anything as Dillashaw was getting back to his feet either. That's normally when Cruz sneaks in a couple of nice shots there. He got nothing going off of those.
Also, give credit to the fact that Cruz, who often gets hit on the brakes himself, was not hit escaping from any takedowns either. Both of these guys were.
He did get hit a couple of times when in the fourth and the fifth round when Dillashaw dove in on takedowns, and actually once in the third too. Okay. Dillashaw dives in on a single leg and catches Cruz with a clean right hook on the way out.
It does still happen then.
Yeah, but I think Cruz was better about it.
I think so, yeah. He seemed to be a little more cautious because in the past I think he's had a problem with pulling back with his head straight up, moving back in a straight line. He was really, really going side to side constantly in this fight, where he really never left his head over one hip for very long as he was retreating.
Yeah, one more thing to gush about that I really wanted to remark on for Cruz. How fucking tough is he, man?
Yeah.
Like, he ate at least, by my count, 3 clean head kicks. And a couple more that glanced off, and not to mention, a whole lot of clean straight lefts, right hooks from TJ Dillashaw, uppercuts, and he didn't get wobbled at all. That is amazing.
Yeah, how about the vicious right hook that he threw his chin into in the 5th round, which man, I didn't even realize how horribly clean it was until I saw the replay. Where Dillashaw's coming forward about 4 minutes 15 seconds into the 5th round, and throws a left. Cruz slips. Dillashaw knows Cruz is going to counter with a counter right of his own and steps off to the side and smashes him with his right hook. And Cruz, throwing himself into his counter right, his chin just falls straight into the shot, whips his head around. He's fine. The dude is insanely durable. Both Dillashaw and Cruz. But we know Cruz is not as powerful a hitter as Dillashaw. And we know Dillashaw can crack, especially as fights go on. He carries his power late and has an attritive effect. Didn't really seem to bother Cruz.
Yeah. I mean, this was just what a fascinating matchup. I mean, there are so many different things that we could talk about here, but one of the the perception to me was one of the big things that stood out here. So perception on a couple of different levels. One of the things that we just talked about with Cruz's durability and his ability to make those clean head kicks and clean shots look like Dillashaw wasn't landing hardly at all, that he was able to shrug those off, that he was able to make his own offense look more effective than it was, that he was able to use his defense and the fact that Dillashaw was missing to make it look like Dillashaw wasn't doing as much as he was. We've talked before about the art of bullshit, and that's not a derogatory thing at all. That is part of fighting, is the ability to convince the people that are watching that you're winning.
Apparently many people in the world have never heard of friendly epithets. Because when I say bullshit, I always say it endearingly. Like, man, this dude is a bullshit artist. Like when you say don't bullshit a bullshitter, you're not calling yourself an idiot or an asshole or a liar, right? You're saying, hey, I know how to play this game too. It's a game, and it's a beautiful game in combat sports when these guys can do this. Our mutual friend Schwan Humes asked me, I think it was him, he asked me if Dominick borrowed a few tricks from Ben Henderson's game, because I've always talked about Ben Henderson as a great bullshitter in the past. I thought Cruz far surpassed whatever Ben Henderson has ever done as a bullshit artist. I thought he was so good at downplaying things in this fight. And that's not to say, while that doesn't mean that if I'm watching carefully for these things, I won't score them. I won't think it makes him win the fight. I gotta respect his ability to make everyone else think he won the fight. I really, really do. And I think it's hard to discuss these things because we always try to talk about things from a technical perspective. You can no-sell a shot in a sense, or decrease its effect by rolling with it, or by deflecting some of the power before it lands, or moving back as it lands, or something. But often that has the opposite effect, where if you roll with the shot, this happens for Robbie Lawler sometimes, people think he's being hit cleanly when his head snaps back, when he's really falling back with the punch and taking some of the sting off of it. Cruz took some shots flush and just made it look where if you weren't watching perfectly carefully, or if you didn't have the perfect position at ringside as a judge, you might not have known he got hit, because it wasn't technical. It was just not giving a damn about being hit and not looking like he was trying not to give a damn. He just did not react and was not phased. And if he was hurt, he hit it beautifully well, just as he did with his leg or foot injury in the 4th and 5th rounds. If you hadn't seen the moment when he was hurt, there were not a lot of moments in those rounds where you would have gone, yes, this guy's on a bad leg. It cropped up a few times when he was kicked or when he had to put weight on it, but for the most part, he disguised it so well. And you have to give him credit for that. There's so much to admire in that, and it's one of those unteachable things. I think that ability to make decisions, the ability to play things off, that's just a testament to how smart Dominick Cruz is and what a natural fighter he is, that he has this veteran wile, this level of craft that you just kind of have to learn through experience.
Yeah, I mean, I'm comfortable saying he's maybe the smartest fighter I've ever watched. I think him and John Jones are probably I would say the two smartest fighters in the cage. I think Conor McGregor is coming up on that now at this point. But like just the sheer craftiness to what they do, the ability to make the right decisions under pressure, to be both organic and rote at the same time, to understand the importance of perception, to understand how things play over 5 rounds, that Cruz's defensive movements in the 5th round were not the same as his movements in the 1st round. We talked a lot about TJ Dillashaw's adjustments, but Cruz adjusted too. Like in the 5th round, when he could sense the fight slipping away, Cruz threw a whole bunch of fuck you punches at TJ Dillashaw in a way that Cruz has never thrown fuck you punches in the entirety of his career before.
I think I used that phrase live when I was watching too, because he seemed to feel the fight slipping away. He knew that his leg or his foot, whatever it was hurt. He knew that Dillashaw was coming on, and he just went after Dillashaw. He took the risk and he went after him with 4 or 5 punch combinations, throwing heat. Not something Dominick Cruz typically does. He went after him. Late in the fight too, after it seemed like his power had started to leave him and Dillashaw's had remained, he just brought it out of the pocket and went after him with these heavy punches, not just to scare him off, but a lot of people thought that Cruz won that 5th round. And that's why, he threw heat, he landed. Even when he wasn't landing, Dillashaw was blocking punches, whereas Cruz looked like he was just not there to be hit. And so the perception that Cruz helped create, this narrative he helped sell, is that he was landing when he wanted to land, even if he was hitting gloves. Some of that force was being transferred, while Dillashaw was still missing entirely a lot of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I want to reinforce this, that even though I scored the fight for Dillashaw, I think you could score that. You could make a reasonable argument to score that for Cruz, because that perception matters, because it looked like he was winning the fight. You could easily say, well, he did win the fight. Like that the perception of that matters. And I think that that's a totally valid way to look at that. I'm not going to hate on somebody who turns in a 48-47 Cruz scorecard. I will hate on Tony Weeks, but for that 49-46 card with the last 4 going to Cruz. But like that's valid. That's an important thing. That's a big part of how fighting works.
That's like when I almost brought myself to defend the judge. I can't remember her name. The one who gave Mayweather Canelo a draw.
Adelaide Byrd?
No, it was a woman.
Yeah, Adelaide Byrd is a woman.
It's another woman. Sorry.
Patricia Morse Jarman?
No, CJ something?
CJ Ross.
CJ Ross, that's the one. And she gave it a draw. And I kind of said, I can see why a draw is real in this fight. I still got shit over this, but I think it was a relatively close fight that Mayweather won. And at the time, I kind of defended her decision. Then I looked at which rounds she actually had a draw, and it was almost the complete reverse of what I had. And I was like, nope, I'm going to back away from this one. Same thing with Tony Weeks. I can see you giving Cruz a win. If you made a really good argument and you really wanted Cruz to win, I could maybe see 4 rounds, though I think 3 rounds is the most he got. But Tony Weeks given the 4 final rounds all to while giving one of the closer rounds, the first, to Dillashaw, I don't really know where he was coming from with that one. So anyway, we said we weren't going to argue too much about scoring. Why don't we talk about another fight, which had suspect scoring, to get away from this topic, which was Anthony Pettis versus Eddie Alvarez.
You know what? I'm going to lead with this. I feel bad for Anthony Pettis because I think that of the 2 decisions in the night, he got jobbed. He got absolutely jobbed here. Like, one of the criticisms of Anthony Pettis has been that he doesn't do enough, he doesn't throw enough volume. Well, Anthony Pettis came out here, he landed almost 4 strikes a minute. That's way more than Anthony Pettis usually lands. He was active. His hands looked good. He was throwing nice counters. He was better at range in the way that he moved. He was finding a nice little inside angle for his straight left. He was picking Alvarez off with counter right hooks and counter straight left. He was battering away to the body with powerful kicks. He easily landed the more powerful shots at range, and he got wall installed. This was like a vintage Nick Lentz performance from Eddie Alvarez.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out that Pettis did a lot of that activity while backing up. which has often been the problem. Pettis has sometimes thrown more volume, but typically it's when he kind of smells blood or he feels himself getting into the rhythm, like against Ben Henderson in their rematch, like against Donald Cerrone. He feels that he is in control and comes forward, and he has the other person reacting, and so he starts to throw. Being pressed has always been what really takes away his volume, and he did a much better job than ever before of keeping his activity level up, throwing enough punches, throwing kicks, even while spending large portions of that fight going backwards. Yeah, truly wall install. I don't know what else to say about it. Credit to Eddie Alvarez for doing what he thought would work. I think it was a smart decision to try to wrestle with Anthony Pettis. Watching the fight, I did think it was maybe a little more effective than I expected it to be, but not effective in any scoring sense. I don't think I can. Do you? I mean, you know that you have somewhat idiosyncratic scoring. I do tend to value grappling a little more than you, I think, in my scorecards.
It's not that I don't value grappling. It's that there is no place for outweighing clean, effective, damaging striking at range with wall install.
And I do agree with
that. Like that is not a possible way to read the rules in any reasonable sense.
Anthony Pettis did have some problems that were still there, though. I do feel bad. I think he solved his volume problem, like you said, or at least has made some headway into fixing it. The one thing that you and I were discussing before we began today's show is his inability to counter wrestle effectively. And there are two possible theories that we can see that explain this. Why he allows himself to be controlled up against the cage. And I do think there was an element of him allowing it. One is that he just doesn't spend that much time on taking his back off the fence. His takedown defense is obviously a lot better than it was. He's not as easy to put on his back, but he didn't seem to know how, or, which I think is a little more likely, I don't think he cares about getting his back off the fence as much as he needs to. While you and I, again, another case kind of bullshit, you and I agree that he probably should have won this fight based on landing the more damage. We also can agree that no sane fighter should ever be allowing themselves to be put against the fence or not trying hard to keep from spending 3 minutes of every round pressed against the fence.
It doesn't do you a goddamn bit of good to have your back up against the fence.
Yeah, it's certainly not doing you any favors. Even if you should be winning the rounds, help yourself out a little bit.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, like it's an inexcusable tactical error to be as willing to be spending time with your back up against the fence as Pettis was. And so what occurred to me as I was watching this fight and then afterwards as I was thinking about it was, so when I used to go into Verdum's on Saturdays to get some sparring work in and get some extra work in, I would show up at like 11:30 and I would catch the end of Fabricio's training sessions with his wrestling coach, Kenny Johnson, and a succession of big, strong heavyweights. And he would spend hours and hours and hours working on nothing but getting his back off the fence. So he would have a rotation of guys working with him, working on pressing him up against the fence in various positions and working takedowns against the fence. And all Verdum would be working on would be, okay, you have X amount of time to get off the fence. How many moves to get yourself in a position to push off and create space? And then he would work on variations of that, of landing strikes off of that, different ways to get himself out of position there, like all of those things. And he must have spent 30 hours just that I'm thinking about working on only that skill.
And when you consider that, the amount of time he put into that, it's not surprising. Not so surprising as it was then that Cain Velasquez wasn't able to control him against the cage like he normally does. It's not surprising. Yeah, exactly. He managed to get himself. Whereas from Anthony Pettis' perspective, it was surprising, and I don't think anything would make it unsurprising that Eddie Alvarez, who's not really that great of a controlling wrestler type, was able to spend the majority of the time in this fight, over 50% of the time in this fight at least, with Anthony Pettis being trapped against the fence.
Yeah, it's surprising, and I mean, and you can't blame Alvarez for having tried that. I think you can blame the judges for scoring it for him. And again, I'm going to be salty about this because I think that I think that that's an unconscionable thing. Like to score holding a guy up against the fence, even if it's for a longer period of time, over clean, effective, damaging striking is just like that's not how this is supposed to work. It's just not.
I would agree. I'm sure there are people out there who would disagree with us. I know there are people who think that we undervalue grappling in general. Obviously, it's not our strong suit in the way that striking is, but I think both you and I don't know. I don't see how you can hit somebody in the face 10 times and then get held against the fence for 3 minutes and lose the round if they're not hitting you 10 more times harder than you. I don't really get it.
Well, I mean, the way it's supposed to work is that a takedown in and of itself, it doesn't do much for you. It doesn't do much for you.
It's control more than anything.
Yeah, well, in the absence of anything else happening, yeah, that takedown matters. But in general, if you don't get a takedown and then hit the guy a bunch, or get a takedown and then pass and then attempt a submission or what have you, then your takedown didn't really do much for you unless it's a slam, unless it's like a damaging, high amplitude kind of takedown that in itself is a substantial moment. Like, just holding somebody shouldn't count for much unless nothing else happens.
Yeah,
and
which is how
not that fight.
Which is how I think control is supposed to be judged anyway. Control, like volume, is meant to be judged in the absence of another defining characteristic. So if the striking and the grappling in terms of offense are both equal, then you might consider control. Personally, I would like to see that, like defense, just removed from the scoring criteria. I think judging control, who is better controlling the octagon or the cage or the ring, there's a lot of room for subjectivity there. There's a lot of room for bringing your biases, and we all bring biases and preconceived notions into fights when we are judging them and scoring them and even just viewing them. Our perceptions are altered by what we expect to see, so we're not really seeing the same thing that everyone else is watching, even if we're watching it at the same time. So to add a criteria which is basically, well, whoever you think looks like they're doing what they want to be doing more, that's effectively what control is. Because you can be controlling the octagon by defending takedowns and by moving off the back foot and maintaining the distance, or you can be controlling the octagon by pursuing takedowns and by chewing up the distance. So there shouldn't be a criterion where two people can be doing exactly what they want and both. You basically just get to pick your favorite and say that they're having the more effective control, But that's an argument for another day. Why don't we take another quick break? When we come back, we're going to discuss a topic that's maybe a little closer to our hearts than it is to the rest of the MMA community, and we'll try to explain why that is. And then we're going to get to some of you guys, some of your guys. I've never been clear on the grammar there. Some of our listeners' heavy bag questions from people who have pledged to us on Patreon. So all of that after this break. Okay, so here's another way you can help us out. Go to your couch, lift up the cushions, and scrounge around in the creases for change, lint, like bent paper clips, like a thumbtack that you stab your thumb on and then you scream alone in your living room. Throw all the stuff out except the change. All right, now take that and deposit it into your bank account or your PayPal account. Head over to heavyhandspodcast.com and click on the donate button on the right side of your screen. Whatever money you just found, which you weren't using anyway, send it to us, all right? Because Pat and I will use it. That money helps us keep this show on the air and free of charge, which is great for you. It's great for us because that way we're making a little bit of money. The donations are a huge deal for us. So please go to heavyhandspodcast.com. Any spare change that you might have lying around, hit the donate button on the right side of the screen and send it our way to help us keep this show live. Thanks. And now back to Heavy Hands. And we are back. I mentioned before the break, a topic close to our hearts, a topic that gets us even more salty than Pat just got in that last segment. And really, I could taste the salt all the way from here in Cincinnati when you're talking about that decision. Do you want to go ahead and breach the waters for this one?
Yeah, so I want to talk about the moment where I became a lifelong fan of Dominick Cruz, and that was in his post-fight speech when he took a brief second to say, "Hey, Kenny Florian, stop copying and pasting."
Yes.
So what he was referring to there is a topic that's near and dear to both your and my hearts for both the same and for different reasons. But Kenny Florian wrote an article for Fox Sports in which he took wholesale from a video done by boxing analyst Lee Wiley on Willie Pep.
So, by the way, the only good thing about this is that it may have given Lee, because it came out, a little publicity, and that's a good thing because Lee does fantastic work. If you guys haven't seen his videos, you absolutely should check them out.
Yeah, absolutely. He does a fantastic job, and so yeah, if this leads to more attention for lead, that's fantastic. But it is completely unacceptable to take somebody's work without attribution, and that's what Kenny Florian did. And he came up with a couple of unconvincing excuses about it that basically focused on the idea that he has a file of notes into which he's just copied and pasted things, and he thought that he had written this, and he'd forgotten to properly attribute it. Which, even if that's the case, and I'm not convinced that it is because of the way that this played out. Even if that's the case, it's still sloppy, lazy, and totally unacceptable. So props to you, Dominick Cruz, because this is not okay. You can't take somebody's intellectual property without attribution.
Yeah, well, let's try and explain it from our perspective, because two things about this were shocking. First, that it happened, and there are many reasons why the circumstances surrounding this bit of plagiarism were shocking to me, and we'll get into that in a moment. I know this isn't normally the kind of topic we discuss in the show, but it's a worthwhile thing to discuss because we are professional analysts. This is what we do. This is how we earn our bread. We talk about fights. We watch footage. We do take notes, and we give our findings to you guys. And if we're lucky, we get paid to do it. And so the other thing that shocked me is that other people weren't upset about this, because it seemed like a lot of MMA fans heard this story and we're just kind of like, I don't see what the big deal is. So he took a line, whatever. It's not like that. There's a weird thing where if you're in a creative industry where you are an architect or a painter or a musician or a writer, something where you can do it as an amateur creative or as a creative professional, people seem to not have value for the work. Where in our field, I'm sure Pat has been asked to write things for free in the past, as have I. Musicians often get asked to play shows for free. There's this idea that because it's not real, it's created, it's not as valuable as somebody else's job. Because you would never ask someone to, plumb your house for free. And in the same way, people don't seem to value the theft of creative property, the theft of intellectual property, the same way they do real property. Because if the story came out that Kenny Florian broke into Lee Wiley's house and stole his computer, nobody would say, I don't see what the big deal is. That would be a massive scandal. But he essentially did that. He went to something that Lee Wiley had put research into, put time into, a video that he did on the footwork of the great Willie Pep, and inserted, word for word, a paragraph from that video into an article about Dillashaw versus Cruz. With no attribution, with no quotation marks, he presented it as a thought that he came up with himself. And Kenny Florian is a college-educated man. He's got a bachelor's degree. He went to a top research university, so he knows that that is incorrect. So either, A, he takes really sloppy notes, and he should know that you can't do that, or B, he's just coming up with an excuse to say, an excuse, by the way, that will only fool people who weren't upset about this in the first place, which just kind of furthers the impression to both of us that Kenny Florian doesn't really give a damn what MMA analysts think. Because anybody who also takes notes and writes articles for a living or who analyzes fights for a living is going to know that that's bullshit.
It's bullshit because I guarantee you every syllabus Kenny Florian got in a humanities class at Boston College included a paragraph on academic honesty, because that's in every academic syllabus. It says, here is the academic honesty policy, or here's a place where you can go read about the academic honesty policy. If you violate this policy, you will fail the assignment, you'll fail the course, and you'll face expulsion. That's how academic honesty works. That's how it works in my field. And I have failed students in courses, and I've sent students to academic honesty boards where they have been expelled from universities, because it's not okay to steal somebody's intellectual property. And that's what you're doing. It is absolutely theft. And I don't want to harp on this or too much, but this is a big deal. It's a legitimate thing. What he did is a serious thing that he shouldn't have done.
And he doubled down on the fact that he did it by making an excuse that either you don't buy, or if you do, it shows that he doesn't respect the people that he stole from. It shows that he still has no respect for them, because it's a story that you have no reason to believe in our industry. And I think it will be a mistake for people to go nuts and go after Kenny Florian. There was some of that in the aftermath, as seems to be the case with everything these days. There's this sense of mob justice. For God's sakes, don't try and find Kenny Florian's private information and release it. Don't harangue him day and night on social media. You're helping no one. You're making yourself look like a bully. But to me, the solution to this is pretty clear. don't read Kenny Florian's shit, don't recommend him to people, and don't trust that what he says is his own material. And it's sad to say that because Kenny Florian's been a pretty likable guy throughout all the time that he's been doing this job, but it just calls into question everything. So it just kind of makes me no longer a patron of his work.
And like you, Connor, I will not be a patron of Kenny Florian's stuff after this. But, because it violates the trust between the analyst and his audience, right?
Yeah.
That, when you're, not to go too deep into the weeds here, but, analysts are brands, right? You have your own personal perspective on things, your own personal outlook that is in large part what you're selling to people to get them to read your stuff.
Like any creative professional. If I were a poet or a novelist or anything, an artist or something like that, I would expect the same respect be given to my work because that's my identity.
Yeah, because and it's not just brand; it's reputation. That we trade on our reputation, and that people build up a trust in the things that we say and the things that we write, and hopefully you earn the trust from your readers and from your listeners over the course of time. And it takes time to build that trust. You have to prove in every single thing that you write and every single podcast that you do that you are worth listening to. So when you plagiarize something, when you steal somebody's work, what you're saying is, I am not worth listening to. Because you can't be sure that what I'm repeating to you is my own original work, is my own original thought process, is my own original writing. If you can't do that, you've lost a lot more than any online lynch mob can take away. Right,
which is why I say the only good thing that could possibly come out of this is that it may shed a little light on the man who actually wrote the words that Kenny Florian took for his own, Lee Wiley, and not thanks to Kenny because he didn't. It only came out because he got caught. He wasn't doing it out of the goodness of his heart to spread, which is great if you do that. If I cite somebody else's work and I say, here, they wrote this article and here's a reference, I often do that because I want them to receive views. The only reason I would not cite them, which I would never do, is because I wanted to present that thought as my own, which at that point it patently isn't. So anyway, with that bit of ugly business out of the way, why don't we move on to the heavy bag? And our first question this week comes to us by way of Jake Christina, who very wonderfully and generously pledged $5 or more to Heavy Hands in the month of December. And Jake's question is, which fighter do you think has added techniques to his or her repertoire that covers previous flaws the best? And his example is Conor McGregor's spinning heel kick, or his wheel kick, spinning hook kick, however you want to call it, to deal with people staying away from his straight left. So what do you think, Pat? What fighter has added a technique or a new strategy or a new tactic or a new way of fighting that has covered a specific flaw the best?
So I think in your and my previous discussions on this, because we did talk about it a little bit before we addressed it, we came up with two distinct examples. And I think the first one to me that really stands out to me is Demetrious Johnson's game against the fence.
Yep.
So Demetrious Johnson, when he was a bantamweight, largely because of his size, but also because of his speed, was essentially an open space fighter. An open space kind of guy. He relied on his speed, his movement, and his ability to change levels and transition very quickly in open space. He did not want to be up against the fence. That's how he lost, in large part, his bantamweight title fight against Dominick Cruz, was he got outsized and outstrengthed by a guy who outweighed him by 20 or 25 pounds on fight night.
Yeah.
Since moving down to flyweight, where he's still giving up size to a lot of guys, John Dodson is a lot bigger than Demetrious Johnson is. Ali Bagautinov, I think, is bigger than Demetrious Johnson is. He's fought a lot of dudes who were bigger than him. He has made up for that size deficit by becoming a technical monster and a strategic monster in the clinch and layering his game up against the fence in really interesting ways. So going from single legs to elbows, having a really tight double collar tie, his ability to transition between different positions in the clinch up against the fence, it has won him entire fights and will continue to do so in the future. I think he's got the best, probably the best fence game in all of MMA right now.
Yeah, I think the two things he's got going for him there, you mentioned the double collar tie already, but the one that I love to watch, which I think a lot of people probably hate to watch, is his mauling from the single leg position. Because obviously Demetrious Johnson's gotten a lot better at wrestling since he was a bantamweight. He's really put the time in and become one of the best wrestlers in the sport. but he doesn't have to finish his takedowns to show off that wrestling ability. Demetrious Johnson is one of the few fighters I know of who is happy to be fed a single leg in defense. Because a lot of fighters will feed you a single leg in order to get away from the double. Jose Aldo does this. Now I'm going to struggle to think of other examples. Ioane Jędrzejczyk does this a lot. Just take it from me, I guess. A lot of fighters do this to defend takedowns. What I mean by that is the opponent will attack both of their legs, both of their hips, and they will turn and take an angle. And that, yes, keeps one of your legs in the control of the opponent, but it keeps them from getting both of your legs, and it allows you to fight off of what is, for a lot of people, an easier takedown to defend, the single leg. Demetrious Johnson doesn't get worried about this. He just holds on to the single leg, runs you into the fence, and keeping that leg tucked tight under his armpit just gets a good head position and pummels away. He did this a lot against John Dodson, and it was almost embarrassing for John Dodson's sake to watch this happen in that fight, where over and over Johnson was able to just hold him there and just pepper him with good sharp shots too. He's throwing decent pop, and then elbows on the break as well to add to that. It's an unorthodox position. It's one that most fighters are not at all happy to accept, and Demetrious Johnson has found a way to make it one of his best positions. I love that.
Because I don't think you could say enough about the layers to it, right?
Right.
Because he tried for doubles early in that fight, couldn't get the double. Then he tried for a single in open space, and he's like, oh, I've got some traction with the single, but couldn't get it to work. So then he grabs the single and pushes him to the fence. And he's like, oh, okay, now we're making some hay. I still can't get him down, but we'll try it again. Then he grabs the single again, pushes him to the fence, and then he's like, okay, can't get him down, but I can hit him here. And so but he did the same thing against Ali Bagautinov with a standing clinch, right? So he tried an overhook and head pressure. Then eventually he hit on the double collar tie, and he's like, oh, he has no answer for this at all. And so it's the sheer brilliance of the layers to it and the way that he tries things out over and over and over again, and slowly but surely breaks you down. That really makes that stand out. But that's not really a side of his game that he had in any meaningful way before 2012 or 2013. You can see
Mighty Mouse ticking through the options on the flowchart in his head, but the flowchart has become one of the most expansive and varied in MMA since his move to flyweight. And it's only after adding those new skills that he's become so effective so consistently. So that's a great one. Thank you for that question, Jake. That was a lot of fun to answer. Our next question comes to us from Bill. I think it's Desrochers, but I may be making it a little too Frenchy. If I knew where Bill was from, I might be able to guess it better. But Bill Desrochers is my best guess. And Bill asks, with regards to hyper-specialization at its increasing rarity, who is the most limited yet effective MMA fighter? And I think Pat and I may surprise you with our answer, because I think Pat and I both agree that hyper-specialization is not as rare as it was maybe 5 years ago. I think we may be entering a new heyday of specialist fighters.
Yeah, because I think we're getting to the point where the baseline knowledge that you have to have of the broad game, pretty much everybody is getting that in every competent MMA gym. Everybody is learning how to shoot double legs covered with punches. Everybody is learning how the double collar tie works. Everybody is learning how to throw jab to low kick. So everybody is learning basic guard passes and ground striking. So we're getting to the point now where the value to being a well-rounded fighter is going away, because everybody is, in some sense, well-rounded. But we're getting to the point where to succeed at the most elite levels, you have to have a hyper-specialized skill set that's going to be simply better than everybody that you're going to fight. So I think the clearest example of this is Ioane Jędrzejczyk.
Yes, absolutely. I think... It may sound a little counterintuitive, because we're saying that we're seeing more specialization because the skill set is broadening. But I think that there's a difference between specialization in training, which is what we used to see in the sport, and specialization in practice, or how specialized the expression of your fighting style is. You are specialized in what you try to do in the cage. Back in the day, we used to see fighters who were specialized in, they'd only trained a few things. And that's obviously a flawed approach, because they would come in against somebody who had sort of the yin to their yang, and they would just own them. or not the yin to their yang, I guess the rock to their scissors, and would smash them. So we had guys coming from a Taekwondo background, they'd face someone with a decent knowledge of takedowns and a good ground game, and they would get owned. And then we came into an era of the wrestle boxers, the guys who would stuff the takedowns and hit you. And then they started to get outworked by people who would use the fence to their advantage. And we have all of these layers. I think nowadays we are seeing the specialization of pure strikers who are learning really well to not only stop, but disincentivize takedowns. It's kind of the new era of the sprawl and brawler, but far more technical than that name really implies. And I think it's not only Ioane and Jacek, but I think Conor McGregor fits into that category as well. You might be able to put... Go on.
But I would argue that it works even for other skill sets too. That I think that we see it most commonly with strikers, but I think that hyper-specialized wrestlers and hyper-specialized jiu-jitsu specialists can also work. Because look at Damian Maia. There's absolutely no nonsense to his approach. You know exactly what he's going to do to you, but he can still make it work because of his singular ability to do that. Because he's not helpless on the feet. He knows how to box, and he knows how to do it well enough to get himself to where he wants to be otherwise. Or I think Khabib Nurmagomedov, who is a decent enough striker. It's not like he doesn't know how to strike, but really he's a wrestling specialist.
And you know he wants to wrestle you. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's the parameters by which we should define a specialist. When you fight them, you kind of know where they want the fight to be. You don't have to guess. And there are a lot of those guys nowadays, and they're still effective. They're more effective than they were a few years ago. So yeah, it's interesting, but I think we may be entering a new zenith of that kind of fighting, of that having a really clear focus and having enough background to the rest of your game that you can make it happen no matter what, even if the other guy knows what you want to do to him or her.
Because I would just one tiny little thing that I wanted to add to that, because even Demetrius Johnson, for as well-rounded as he is, I would still say is a specialist in transitions.
Sure.
Right. So his specialty isn't striking or wrestling or grappling. His specialty is the ability to get between those spaces and hurt you there. But so if you could shut down that one aspect of his game, you would have a lot of success in beating him.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Or potentially have some success. So there are a lot of different ways to be a specialist.
Would Fabricio Verdum be a counter to our point? Is he now a fighter from an old era where he is not a specialist but a fighter with two very clear skill sets?
Yeah, entirely possible. I don't think that this necessarily applies to everyone, and I think heavyweight is kind of an exception because the talent is so thin.
It is a division out of another era in many ways.
Yeah, it's
like 35 or older.
From a technical perspective, it's like 8 years behind everything else.
Yeah, so in a way that is sometimes enjoyable when you're not watching Mitrione versus Brown.
just Travis Brown try and scoop Matt Mitrione's eyeball out with his thumb, like. Jesus.
So our final question comes to us from Wayne Chargaloff, and Wayne asks, how important is respect to a pressure fighter? If you have a good chin, decent enough power, and you just don't give a fuck, can you shut down large aspects of a pressure fighter's game? Also, do you think a fighter can effectively pressure if they don't possess significant power? He snuck in two questions there, Pat. He snuck them in both as if they were one.
Well, so I think the answer to the first part of that is that he basically just described a boxer puncher, somebody who doesn't give a fuck, who has a decent amount of pop in their hands, and who's willing to just stand their ground and throw back at you, who's fine with exchanging.
Or I would say a counterpuncher, because I think counterpunchers, really defined counterpunchers, and I do still believe they are the rarest of fighters, but I think they are actually pretty effective at dealing with swarmers and pressure fighters too. Guys who have enough defense and enough confidence to not care about range so much as they care about avoiding what you throw at them and hitting you with something hard in return. So my favorite example of this is Juan Manuel Marquez versus Juan Diaz. It's a fight that everyone should watch. Counter fighter just picking apart somebody who wants to come forward and puts a ton of pressure on them. And we just don't have a lot of counter fighters in MMA. Even all the ones we have that are good counter punchers tend to be pressure fighters, like Chad Mendes and Anthony Johnson. So I don't think we're going to get a chance to see a lot of this going forward. But I do think a good counter fighter, because again, the idea that you don't respect what the other person's going to do. You're not afraid of being in there, being in close. You're not afraid of accepting their range. You're just concerned about stopping them from doing what they do and answering. So,
yeah. As far as the second part of that, what do you think, Connor? Do you think you need to be powerful or dangerous to be a good pressure fighter?
I think it helps, but I think mechanics are king, especially with pressure. And I think a lot of, you can basically watch any Friday Night Fights type card, RIP, because Friday Night Fights is no more. But you can watch any TV broadcast boxing card and see a pressure fighter, usually some like career journeyman out of Mexico who is just coming forward and not doing much, but he's a fairly decent test for the guy who was clearly brought in to beat him up. And a lot of the problems with these guys, you kind of get the sense, if you watch boxing, contrary to MMA, that pressure fighting is ineffective because these guys are just hopelessly running after these slick, defensive, usually American fighters who are landing good counter punches and making them look silly and taking what they're dishing out with ease. But I think it often comes down to mechanics. When you're coming forward, it's really tempting to just throw your weight at the other guy and to get past your own feet and in your desperation to close the distance and get in the pocket. And I think if anybody in the same weight class as their opponent keeps their feet under their body and steps and transfers weight with their punches, they can hit more than hard enough to demand respect from the opponent.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll give you a specific MMA example of a guy who liked to pressure but didn't have much power, and that was Ross Pearson. And I think that Pearson was fairly effective with that. I mean, like, watch the Pearson-Barboza fight, and you can see how effective a not particularly threatening but technically sound and willing pressure fighter can be.
How about Rick Story?
Yeah, but I think... Rick Story does not have a whole lot of knockdowns to support the idea that he has power, but it still always looks to me like he hits pretty hard.
But I think it's just mechanical. Like, if Rick Story was really a gifted puncher, he would be getting knockdowns and knockouts. He doesn't tend to, but he looks like he's putting his weight correctly into his punches. He's got good punching mechanics.
That's a really good point. That's a really fair point. Yeah, I'm with you there.
So you can tell when he's landing a good, clean punch. You can tell that it's well-timed, and you can tell that he's balanced as he throws it. You can see that power being transferred. And he's just not killing people with him, but he's very effective, and he's been effective for a long time, and he often likes to come forward and beat people up. So, I think anybody has enough power. I think we tend to focus on power a little too much. Obviously, power is the most exciting thing. It's the most prized gift that a fighter can have. In some ways, a big curse as well. But power isn't the end-all, be-all of being an effective fighter. There are very few fighters who just don't have enough power to get somebody else to respect them. Unless you're unlucky enough to be fighting a guy like Conor McGregor who just doesn't seem to give a damn even if you do have punching power. And then what do you do to scare him off? But that's another story. I think most fighters can be taught enough lessons with the average person's power, provided they know how to deliver that power effectively and consistently. So thank you, everybody, for your questions. If you have pledged $5 or more to the show on Patreon, then please send us your questions as soon as you can. There's a messaging function on Patreon. Just send them to us. You'll be prompted when you pledge, and send them to us when you pledge. And we'll have a turnover time, probably about 6 months or a year, where everybody who has pledged for that length of time will get to ask another question. That way you don't pledge once, have that money keep coming out of your account and helping us out, and don't get more bang for your buck. So we do appreciate everyone who's helped out the show. Before we wrap up, let's let the people at home know what we're working on. What do you have coming out this week, Pat?
So I wrote a technical recap / breakdown of Dillashaw Cruz. Just a quick little thing, maybe 1,000 words for you to chew on, with some thoughts on what went right and wrong for each guy. And then coming on Friday, I will have the second part of my and Scott Harris's joint project, a top 25 list of the best prospects in the world for 2016. Really excited about this. We cast a wide net. We came up with some awesome prospects, so I would appreciate it if y'all gave it a read.
Awesome. And I love the prospect stuff you did for Bloody Elbow back in the day. So
yeah, this is the same methodology, very, very similar kind of approach, basically the same kind of thing. But Scott did the first half, or wrote up the first half, and I wrote up, and I'll be writing up the second half.
Then it'll be worthwhile reading. As for me, I am going to try to put out the first of my best of 2015 breakdown articles. I said I'd do it last week, but that Dillashaw Cruz breakdown ended up being a really long two-parter. And I will have kind of the opposite of what you did, Pat. I'm going to try and do the most in-depth technical breakdown I can. Probably going to try and crank it out in one part, 2,500 to 3,000 words if it goes as planned, which I know is quite a read, but I think it's that kind of fight. It's a hardcore fan fight where you just want to delve into it and get all the details out of it you can. So look for a big, lengthy piece with a lot of examples and a lot of technical nitty-gritty and mumbo-jumbo and things that you will have to like quickly close your laptop if your mom comes in the room, because she'll find out you're a nerd and you won't be able to look her in the eye anymore. It's just too embarrassingly geeky. So look for that from me this week. Otherwise, thank you for listening to the show today. Don't focus too much on the decision, everybody. I know it's hard not to. I'll still be complaining about it this week. It may seem like everybody's still upset, but damn, that was a good fight between Dominick Cruz and TJ Dillashaw. I can't wait to see them fight again. I really hope. I don't know, Pat, you think this is a case where an immediate rematch is called for?
I would be happy if they did it, but I think that what they'll do is probably Cruz Faber 3, and then put Dillashaw versus somebody on the undercard. So when or if Dominick Cruz or Uriah Faber gets injured, you still have a really good fight. Yeah. That is my guess for what they'll do going forward.
That sounds sensible. I would like to see either of those, but I would really like to see this fight again. Even if it plays out the exact same way, I would watch it again just to see one or two little things that happen in different order or different adjustments. I would love it. So we hope you guys enjoyed it as much as we obviously did, and we hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.